Hello everybody, welcome back to the continuation of lessons in the MOOCs program on literature and the environment as part of the environmental humanities. We shall now turn to a very specific domain within the environmental humanities, that's literature and the environment, and this is the first part of a two-part lesson. What does the ecological imagination in literary texts include? As part of the introductory comments, let's take a look at this particular dimension as to the inclusions within the ecological imagination. The ecological imagination literary text includes a concern for the environment in general, but the difference is it approaches it as an aesthetic appreciation of the land. It could include a concern for specific life forms, animals or plants, and their rights, called animal rights, but often of their violence, usually across literary and cultural texts, includes a sense of wonder at their life worlds. It involves a concern and depicts a concern for the interconnected nature of all life forms and ecosystems. Finally, it includes a concern for processes and conditions that affect the above three. These processes, mostly driven by human life and human cultural practices, are climate change, industrialization, pollution, the genocide of animals, the loss of rural ways of life and habitats. That was our introduction. We shall now move on. Our first component in our study of the connection between literature and the environment is landscape appreciation. You'll recall I just said that there is a very strong aesthetic component to the representation of environment in literature. Aesthetic representations of nature, landscape, animals, the horizons, various features of the land are of two types traditionally in poetry. The land may be represented pretty as a picture, like a postcard, organized, limited, often poor, but calm. This would be the aesthetics of the picturesque, popularized for the first time in 18th century English romantic poetry and theorists like William Gilpin. Or the landscape could be represented via a different kind of aesthetic which produces fright, which looks at things like rolling seas, vast horizons, mountains piled on mountains. The view will be grand, frightening, expansive, and induces awe. This would be the aesthetics of the sublime, first theorized by Edmund Burke in England in his book of an aesthetic variety published in 1757, although theories of the sublime date back to the ancient Greeks, Longinus, and others. Famous poems that depict the aesthetics of the picturesque from the canonical English literary tradition would include Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, Nothing, The Ruined Cottage. It also includes Percy Shelley's To a Skylark or John Keats's To Autumn, and more contemporary Robert Frost's famous Stopping by the Woods or Birches. Instances of the sublime may be found in Percy Shelley's grand poem about the mountains Mont Blanc. Elsewhere, if you were to run a quick list of poetry with ecological themes, there is a list in front of you. The list includes both English and American writers, but it also includes writers from other parts of the world. So we have William Wordsworth, John Clare, A.R. Ammons, Gary Snyder, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Crabbe, the famous American writer Emily Dickinson, the 18th century topographical writer John Denham, James Thompson, the American Robert Frost, the Native American Joy Harjo, India's Mamang Dai from the Northeast, and Ted Hughes. Let's spend a little time now looking at one particular theme, that is human material cultures or materialism and nature. Let's take a look at Wordsworth's famous The World is Too Much with Us. An extract is up there for you to take a look at. The world is too much with us, late and soon getting and spending we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, we have given our hearts away a sordid boon. That's William Wordsworth, The World is Too Much with Us. What is the emphasis in this particular poem of Wordsworth's? There is a constant emphasis on the worldly and the material, as he puts it, getting and spending, which might refer to commercial transactions, money, earning, currency, transactions involving economic processes, earning a livelihood, etc. What Wordsworth does is to suggest that this emphasis on earning, spending, commercial transactions cause the loss of human connection with nature. And this loss actually is the loss of the very heart of humanity. Thus, Wordsworth insists that everyday life and work has alienated mankind from nature, and he blames our insistence on material success, on material acquisition, on money and things and objects as producing this alienation. So that was our first theme, materialism of the humankind and nature. We will now move on to look at one other principal theme, and that's the wonders of the animal life world. There are two extracts there, one extract and one full poem. The first one on the left of your screen is Emily Dickinson's famous "A Bird Came Down the Walk." And on the right is Alfred Lord Tennyson, England's poet laureate, The Eagle. Read the poems for yourself, and then we shall move on to a small discussion of what it means. The poem on the left, Emily Dickinson's extract, speaks about two species, a bird and a worm, interacting. On the right, Tennyson's poem speaks about the power of an eagle. The eagle is hunting. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. Tennyson's eagle and the bird in Emily Dickinson's poem are two species that have come into considerable attention here. The wonders of the animal world, and up on your screen next is Ted Hughes' Hawk Roosting, a very well-known, very anthologized poem from the contemporary era. Discussions of the wonders of animal life worlds often include a sense of awe that creation has this variety of life forms. Within the environmental imagination, this is important because when traditionally we have thought of the humans as being part of the higher animal or life forms, of being supreme among all life forms, these texts ask us to pay attention to other life forms and see them as perhaps symbolic of nature at its best as well. That is, the ecological thought in these texts asks us to see these animal and other life forms as equally worthy of our attention. So Tennyson's eagle or hawk or the other famous Ted Hughes poem, Crow, are all about the power, the beauty, the symbolic value that we should attribute to these creatures. Note here how Ted Hughes represents hawk. It begins with a fairly normal kind of stasis. I sit in the top of the wood, my eyes closed. Inaction, no falsifying dream between my hooked head and hooked feet, or in sleep rehearse perfect kills and eat. Note how the tone and the representation changes in the first 4 lines. The first 3 lines are about stasis, like I said. Nothing is happening. I sit quietly, my eyes closed. Inaction, he says. He's dreaming. The hawk is dreaming. And then in the last line, Ted Hughes' hawk says, in my sleep, I rehearse. And what does the hawk rehearse? Perfect kills and eat. So from the stasis of the first line, we have moved to a violent action, predatory action by the hawk. Note the last 8 lines of the poem. The allotment of death. The hawk's job is the allotment of death. Look at how this is led up to. My manners are tearing off heads, he says, and then says, the allotment of death. For the one path of my flight is direct, through the bones of the living. No arguments assert my right. When humanity has represented itself as supreme, here is the hawk saying, no one, absolutely no life form argues with me. No arguments assert my right. The sun is behind me. Nothing has changed since I began. My eye has permitted no change. I am going to keep things like this. Think of what Ted Hughes' hawk is doing here. Ted Hughes is suggesting to us that we should be perhaps a little cautious as to what we think of ourselves. Here is the hawk who believes he rules the world. I'm going to keep things like this. I don't want any change, is what he's saying. So if you were to think in terms of the link between man and nature and of the hawk and nature, man thinks he's supreme. The hawk also believes it is supreme. Having done that, let's move on to another set of exercises and examples of the linkage between man and nature. As I've already emphasized in the last several modules and lessons, the linkage between man, materialism and nature is central to the environmental imagination and therefore of the environmental humanities. Wordsworth's extract, which is up there on your screen, from The Ruined Cottage, speaks about the sadness the melancholy nature of the breaking of bonds between humankind, as in the human race, and nature itself. He says, "Beside yon spring I stood and eyed its waters till we seemed to feel one sadness, they and I. For them a bond of brotherhood is broken. Time has been when every day the touch of human hand disturbed their stillness and they ministered to human comfort." Wordsworth is mourning, is melancholic about the breakage of the bond between nature and mankind. Nature continues to aid mankind. It is a human hand that disturbed the stillness of nature, he says. Please recall what we have said about the environmental humanities' primary emphasis, that any changes in the global climate, in the global ecosystems, in species death, as it's called, can be attributed to the human hand. So, as Wordsworth's poem famously puts it, it is a human hand that disturbed the stillness of nature. So, Wordsworth sees human life as having altered nature irrevocably. And what we forget, what we choose to ignore, is that man cannot survive without being embedded in a sustaining and sustainable environment, which is, of course, our next theme. Our next theme is man who is embedded in nature and the world. And our text here for our study purposes is Joy Harjo's Eagle poem. To pray, you open your whole self, to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. What is Joy Harjo doing here? Harjo is suggesting that humanity needs to reach out to nature because nature constitutes us. In other words, you cannot think of a self as a bounded self which is autonomous, coherent, and distinct from nature. What Harjo is saying is, if you need to understand yourself, you need to open yourself up. Remember what we have said, the focus of the environmental humanities is the interconnectedness of all life forms. Our mutual dependency, symbiotic relationship, and interconnectedness is at the heart of the environmental humanities. That's what Harjo's poem is saying. Harjo's poem says, let me read it out again. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. So humanity needs to reach out to recognize that nature is part of us. The human cannot think of a self that is not open, made of and supported by the world around the ecosystem. Having looked at those, let's move on to a different aesthetic, the sublime in nature. And my extract here up there for you to take a look at is from Percy Shelley's Mont Blanc. The description is of ravines, caverns, pines and crags. Is this a pleasant description? Is this a description that it gives you peace, or does it disturb you? As should be obvious, this is a description of nature that is, as he puts it, bursting through these dark mountains like the flame or lightning through the tempest. It's of nature that is dynamic, active, mobile, and highly energized. It is the description of nature that is inherently perhaps violent and destructive. This is sublime because here Shelley is speaking about nature as awesome, majestic, violent, powerful, limitless. It inspires fear. It inspires something akin to terror. It's sublime because we cannot comprehend the expanse of the sublime. We cannot understand the dimensions of the sublime because human mind cannot take so much of it. Human mind at some moment stops registering this, can't deal with it any longer. So the sublime is an aesthetic that tells us that nature is not easy and peaceful and quiet. Nature is also violent, intrinsically powerful, and can overwhelm us. Other representations of nature include nature as a living organism, personified, but also something else. Let's take a look here at Mamang Dai's lovely poem, Small Towns and the River. The river, she says, has a soul. In the summer, it cuts through the land like a torrent of grief. Sometimes I think it holds its breath, seeking a land of fish and stars. The river has a soul. It knows, stretching past the town from the first drop of rain to dry earth and mist on the mountaintops, the river knows the immortality of water. What does Mamang Dai do here? Mamang Dai personifies nature as a living organism. The river is personified as something with feelings, sensation. It's troubled. It disturbs the land. It has expressions. It has attitude. It has character. This is a standard trope in many environmental poems, ecologically minded poems, where nature's various life forms are personified and given character traits, given feelings. In many cases, of course, the traditional animal fable, they also talk. Let's move on to our next theme, humans and animals, their respective practices, instruments, and way of life. And my extract here is Gary Snyder about Pate Valley. A land of fat summer deer. They came to camp on their own trails. I followed my own trail here, picked up the cold drill, pick, single jack, and sack of dynamite. 10,000 years. Gary Snyder, arguably now one of the biggest names in environmental literature, is suggesting that the human presence is marked by weapons, by instruments that are potentially lethal to the environment. What is he actually saying? He's saying, look, what do I carry? I carry with me a drill, a pick, and dynamite. The human presence is marked by the potentially lethal intervention it can make in nature itself. And the worrying thing is the human effect on the environment lasts very long, up to 10,000 years. As part of my conclusion, let me quickly summarize what we have seen so far. We have explored the linkage between man and nature. We have looked at a central theme in environmental literature, which includes the wonders of the animal life world and the exploration of the animal life world. We have looked at the criticism leveled by people like Wordsworth on the link between human materialism, the pursuit of material pleasures, and the consequent delinking of humanity from nature. We have looked at two key aesthetic frames within which nature has been portrayed, the picturesque and the sublime. And we have used instances from Wordsworth through Percy Shelley to look at these two aesthetics. We have also looked at the embedding, the theme of the embedding of man in human nature. We have looked at the personification of rivers or other aspects of nature in the poetry of Mamang Thai. We have also seen in Gary Snyder's, and that was our last extract, the result of human intervention, that human intervention in nature via instruments and practices and ways of life lasts for 10,000 years. As you can see, the environmental imagination in literature covers a very wide variety of themes, and what you have seen as extracts and samples are only the tip of the iceberg. More to come. Thank you.